This is Outrageous History. Hello, I'm Ernest Granson, and welcome to Outrageous History. Royal scandals fuel the public's imagination just as much, if not more, than scandals involving film and music celebrities. That applies not just to the present, but to any number of centuries past. One of the most bizarre, and if I may say so, revolting scandals took place in the late 1700s and early 1800s, involving George, Prince of Wales, and Princess Caroline of Brunswick. George, the son of King George III, and Caroline, who was not only the daughter of the Duke of Brunswick, but also the Prince of Wales' cousin, were both more than excited, for all sorts of reasons, to tie the knot with each other. That honeymoon period, so to speak, barely made it past the wedding night. Who was at fault for this rather distasteful display of human nature? Well, most historians don't have much positive to say about either of the participants. Today, we have writer Leslie Carroll, author of numerous historical fiction and nonfiction works, and an expert on royal weddings and marriages, with us to talk about the unhappy couple and others who were also unhappy at that time. Leslie, thanks for taking time to visit with us today.
I am so delighted to be here, Ernest. There's nothing more than schadenfreude about those who have nicer clothes and jewels than we do, but just the same, as my people say, mishigas when it comes to lifestyle problems and marital problems.
Well, the Prince of Wales' father, George, King George, had a lot on his mind as far as problems go in the 1790s. England was at war with France, which was just undergoing the French Revolution, and he was under pressure by the Catholic emancipation issue in Ireland. Not to mention he was undergoing a very serious illness, which at times incapacitated him. But probably the worst problem in his life at that time was his son, the Prince of Wales. What was it the prince was doing that was causing his father so much grief?
Well, the prince was a serial womanizer, and of course he was the heir to the throne, and the succession was a big issue. When the king himself is incapacitated, top of mind is who's going to inherit the throne. And the Prince of Wales was born in 1762, so by 1792 he's 30 years old, and tick-tock, he's still not married to, well, actually he is married. In 1785, he secretly married a Catholic woman, which was two strikes against him, because it would have made him ineligible to inherit the throne. And everybody knew about it. And the woman was named Maria Fitzherbert, and she was twice widowed. But this was a big open secret. And meanwhile, George was also busily womanizing with other mistresses, but there was no way in heck that George was going to be able to accede to the throne with a Catholic wife. So George III, the king, had to get his son and heir married to someone eligible as fast as possible. Meanwhile, George was an inveterate gambler, and by this time he had amassed 600,000 pounds of debt, gambling debt, and debt also to his tailors. If you were a member of the British aristocracy, and especially a member of the royal family, you bought everything on credit. And George was a huge fashionista, and as portly as he became, he still wanted to stuff his sausage casing of a form into the most fashionable clothes that he could find. And all the bills to his tailors and the improvements that he was making to his very fashionable London home of Carlton House, forget it. Everything was bought on credit, and all of these tradespersons were very proud to be doing business with the heir to the British throne. So that was a matter of pride for them. But the problem was nobody was being paid. 600,000 pounds nowadays in American dollars is over $115 million. Can you imagine one single human being owing the local tradespersons and his bookies over $115 million? So George had said to his son and heir, now George has 15 children, and all of his sons are not too keen to marry either, and all of his sons are also womanizers, but he's got only one heir, and in the rules of primogeniture, the oldest son is the one who is going to inherit the throne. He says to Georgie Porgy, and that's where we do get this rhyme, Georgie Porgy, puddin' and pie, kissed the girls and made them cry. That's our womanizer here. He says to Georgie Porgy, if you marry a suitable Protestant member of the, a royal family, I will pay off your 600,000 pounds of gambling debts on your wedding night. And George is still in love with, but wildly mistreating his Catholic, secret Catholic wife. And he reluctantly agrees to do this. And Protestant brides are few and far between. You can find them in the Scandinavian countries, but there wasn't anybody who was age appropriate. And you can find them in all of the different German duchies and principalities. And George III was not very keen on first cousins intermarrying, but he allowed his sister Augusta, who was the Duchess of Brunswick Wolfenbüttel, a mouthful, yeah, to talk him into arranging for a match between Georgie Porgy and her daughter Caroline. And remember, these matches were all made sight unseen. And usually a royal marriage was a treaty between nations or city-states in order to avoid anybody going to war with each other. But in this case, this was a marriage to ensure the succession of the British throne.
Well, I'm sorry. Please.
Yeah, no. So now we have the Prince of Wales now being shackled with his first cousin, who he's never seen before, and a portrait of the prince is sent across to Germany, to Brunswick, with the Earl of Malmesbury, who is the prince's equerry. And boy, does the Earl of Malmesbury get a surprise when he gets there and meets the bride-to-be.
Well, all right. So as you mentioned, the Prince of Wales, we're talking about misbehavior here. The Prince of Wales seemed to set his personal moral standards at a pretty low bar. But what about Caroline then? As you just mentioned, she was the daughter. Her character as well was questioned by, numerous aristocrats and politicians.
Caroline might as well have been raised by wolves. Caroline really. Caroline is 26 years old at the time, so she's no blushing virgin, probably in almost any sense of the word. She is something of a hoyden. She's kind of let loose by her mother and father, who haven't paid much attention to anything that she's done, including her personal hygiene and toilette. She runs off into the local villages of Brunswick, delivering baskets of who knows what to the villagers, and kind of overstays her visits and comes back with her hair all askew and hay in her hair, that sort of thing, looking like she might have had a tumble with, the local stable boy. And she's loose-lipped. She has no filter. Whatever she says whatever comes into her head, she, comes right out of her mouth. She'll gossip. She'll talk about anything. She's absolutely unfiltered in every way. And when the Earl of Malmesbury gets there, he is not only horrified by her looks. She has bad teeth. She has kind of frizzy blonde hair. She's short and stocky with what he describes to the prince as épaules impertinentes, broad-shouldered. She's just, kind of, I guess it looks a bit like a fire plug, and as I said, bad teeth, and worst of all, she has absolutely zero hygiene. It seems like she never bathes, and she doesn't even take what my mother would call a sponge bath, which is, washing the armpits and whatever else might normally smell if you've been exerting yourself. And her linen, her undergarments don't appear to be washed. I don't know how the Earl knows this, but it seems to be, she seems to comport herself and smell like a stable girl. And the Earl is appalled, and he takes her parents, the Duke and Duchess of Brunswick, aside and says, this is not going to do. The prince is very proper and very clean, and she can't come over to England like this. We got to sit her down and explain to her that she's got to clean up her act in every possible way. So he says he's writing down in his diary, I had to introduce her to the basics of tooth powder and soap. And she has to learn how to wash her linen, her undergarments, and change them. He's absolutely appalled. And he also explains to Caroline what the basics of proper English etiquette are going to be, that she can't say whatever pops into her head when she's in England. She is not allowed to take lovers, by the way, regardless of what the prince does. And Caroline knows. I mean, there's nothing we think nowadays with the internet and everybody knows everybody else's business, whether you know what your neighbors are doing or we know internationally what royals nowadays are doing. Back then they did too. Caroline knows what the Prince of Wales is like. So she knows he has a lover. She knows that Lady Jersey, she may not know about Maria Fitzherbert, not then, but she knows that he has a lover, a married woman who's Lady Jersey. And the Earl of Malmesbury even says, don't talk about Lady Jersey. I don't care what you know. It's not polite to mention the prince's lovers in public or anywhere else. Just keep your mouth shut. Don't talk about lovers, don't talk politics. Basically stick to the weather and everyone's health, just like in My Fair Lady. They tell Eliza Doolittle there are only certain subjects you can stick to. And Caroline says, yeah, right, kind of rolls her eyes. And she's given a portrait, a miniature, painted miniature, which very popular at the time to give prospective fiancés a portrait. And she wears it on a ribbon around her neck, and her parents think she's delighted and thrilled, and she can't wait to be, the future Princess of Wales. But Caroline is more sanguine about it. She says, yeah, I know what's up. It's a title I want, really. I know he's got a mistress. I know all this stuff, She's much more pragmatic about it.
So she does make it over to England. She agrees to all of this. Her parents agree to it eventually.
She has no choice. Yeah, she makes it over to England, but even though she's, past her minority age-wise, she's 26 years old, she still has no voice in this. The choice has been made for her. She can't say, ja, nein, I don't want this. So she goes to England, and she is met at Greenwich by none other than Lady Jersey. And she knows exactly who this is. And in fact, it was Lady Jersey who had pushed this match, knowing that this was going to be a disaster, because Lady Jersey certainly doesn't want her inamorata, the prince, to fall in love with a wonderful Princess of Wales. Where have we heard this, Charles, Camilla, Diana? There is nothing new under the sun. So just kind of a bit like Camilla pushing Charles to marry Diana because she thinks, this person will never be a rival to me. It is Lady Jersey who has pushed this match, as well, of course, as King George and Queen Charlotta, Lady Jersey is the first person to meet Caroline and her entourage when they arrive on British shores. And Lady Jersey says, let me, I know the prince really well, let me advise you as to how you should dress. And Caroline actually arrived, she was wearing very little cosmetics and had a fairly tasteful dress on. And Lady Jersey said, oh, no, that's not, no, that won't do at all. And she makes her really rouge up her cheeks and frizzle her hair and puts her in a blue and white dress that will look really dumpy on her. Very unflattering. It says, perfect. The prince will love it. Absolutely love it. And so when Caroline and the prince first meet, of course, it's on Caroline that she doesn't smell very good. So she didn't obviously pay attention to the Earl of Malmesbury's warnings. But she is dressed like a circus clown. And that's on Lady Jersey, who did this on purpose, who said, oh, yeah, up the ante with the cosmetics and wear this dress. The prince will love this. And it obviously doesn't flatter her because she, the poor Caroline is her figure is a bit like a fire hydrant to begin with, and this dress does not work. So the prince and Caroline finally see each other for the first time, and the prince literally takes a step back and says to the Earl of Malmesbury, whose actual name is James Harris, he says, has to be said, first of all, that the prince sort of looks like Caroline, only bigger. He is florid up feature. So he's got very red cheeks. He himself is quite portly. And because he's a fashionista himself, he looks like a dandy. So you've got this portly, florid-faced dandy who is greeting this overdressed, over-rouged fire plug. The prince takes a step back when he sees Caroline and says, Harris, I'm not well. Get me a glass of brandy. And the Earl of Malmesbury says, sir, would you rather have a glass of water? Caroline, who has had the prince's miniature around her neck now for the last few months, and of course it's going to be a flattering portrait, says, does he always act like that? I find him very fat and not at all like his picture. This is not a meet cute. All right, so that's how it begins, and that's 3 days before the wedding. That's April 5th-ish in 1795. They will be married on April 8th. Meanwhile, Georgie Porgy is desperate to get his still married Catholic wife back. And he's asking his mother, Queen Charlotta, sees this and says, George, it's up to you as to whether you want to marry Caroline or not. She gives him that out. The queen gives her son that out. And he's like, oh, 600,000 pounds. I owe 600,000 pounds. And Daddykins will pay it off if I marry this one. So he's juggling between, oh my God, I could make so many improvements to Carlton House if I had that money. And then there's this one, but then there's Maria, who I really love. But then again, I could never be king if I still have Maria. But he actually he gets on his horse and he parades back and forth in front of Maria's home 2 days before the wedding, after he's met Caroline, going, hey, I'm still here. I still love you. And Mariah's like, yeah, screw you. Forget it. Yeah, you want my attention now? Sorry. Forget it. Not happening. So they go through the wedding, and it's the night of April 8th, 1795, and Caroline is overdressed. She's thrilled because, she wants to be the POW. She wants to be the Princess of Wales. That's her end game. She knows she isn't getting a prize. Neither is George. George is absolutely drunk. George started drinking that brandy from the minute he said, Harris, get me a glass of brandy. He didn't stop for 3 days. He has to be literally supported by two unmarried dukes as he goes down the aisle. And at one point, he looks like he is literally going to vomit. This is what onlookers at the wedding noted in their diaries. And that could have been the brandy. It could have been Caroline. Caroline is overdressed in silver tissue lace with bows and sparkles all over the place. She's bedazzled. And everybody notes that George looks absolutely sick at the wedding reception. I'm green at the gills. Then again, it could have been the brandy. He's been drinking for 3 days. Then comes the wedding night. Oh, what a wedding night. Somehow, George manages to do his duty twice and then passes out in the grate by the fireplace, by the mantelpiece. And this is my favorite quote from Notorious Royal Marriages, which is my book from 2010 that has the whole chapter about George and Caroline. And each one of the chapters has a little quote from one of the participants in one of the Notorious Royal Marriages that encapsulates what the whole marriage was about. And I took this quote about Caroline, who described their wedding night. And she says, "Judge what it was to have a drunken husband on one's wedding day, and one who passed the greatest part of his bridal night under the grate, where he fell and where I left him." And that's what she told Lady Charlotte Campbell, who was one of her ladies in waiting. So then one more time, George does his duty, total of 3 times in their entire marriage. And then he says, "That's it, I'm done. She smells bad. I don't." And then he complains to one of his aides, his equerries, that he had a suspicion that she wasn't new, meaning not a virgin. How does he know this? He says she told him exclaimed during one of these 3 encounters, and both parties spoke fluent English, French, and German. And French was the language of diplomacy. She exclaims at one point during one of these encounters, "Oh mon Dieu, qu'il est gros! Oh my God, it's big!" And he says to Lord Minto, "Well, how would she have known that if she hadn't had prior experience?" So this now becomes a little seed planted in George's brain that his wife wasn't a virgin, and therefore, down the line, he's going to want a divorce because she wasn't new. He didn't want her anyway. So he vows he will never again touch her because she smells bad and her linen was dirty and it had marks of filth on it. And, we can allow our imaginations to go there. So never again does he want to be with Caroline. And I think they were together for something like 3 weeks as a married couple. And then they separate, first to separate parts of Carlton House and then back and forth to separate establishments. And miracle of miracles, a baby! On January 7th, I believe it was, 1796, Caroline gives birth to what they describe as an enormous girl. And she's named Charlotte Augusta for both of her grandmothers. And George then decides to punish Caroline even further by refusing her access to her daughter so that she isn't even allowed to mother her in even the slightest way that royal mothers would have been given access to their children. She gets to see her on occasion, but really has no contact with her because George feels that she'd be a bad influence on her. Of course, George is not a hands-on father at all. And George, the serial adulterer, bigamist, and womanizer is not a hands-on father either. And George comes up with what he calls the Carlton House system, which is to keep Caroline more or less a prisoner. She's more or less under house arrest at their London mansion, townhouse at Carlton House, where she is under constant supervision and surveillance under the aegis of none other but Lady Jersey, reports on just about everything that Caroline does, and finally Caroline insists on breaking free, and she moves to Montague House in Blackheath, which is off of Greenwich Park. It's not there anymore, sadly. But Caroline finally gets her own establishment, but she still doesn't have contact with her own daughter in the way that she would like to. But at least the battling Waleses have separate establishments from each other, and now they live separate lives.
So they live separate lives, but despite that banishment from that any kind of marital relationship, that didn't stop her from her mainly physical relationships. I found it curious that through that time she was able to attract quite a number of men to her various bedrooms. But I mean, when the prince could hardly bear to look at her, do you think this was mainly a trait of his flawed character that he couldn't look at her, or was Caroline just that overpowering in her sexual appetite?
I found a wonderful quote, and it might have been Lord Minto, where he says something about Caroline, and that it was really, again, this goes back to, if you mashed up Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves and Charles and Diana in one cauldron, you would get this hellacious marriage of George and Caroline, because there is a wonderful thing. It says Caroline had indiscreetly shared her opinions of her husband's failings in the boudoir, causing the Earl of Minto to remark, "I fancy the mutual disgust broke out at that time. And if I can spell her hums and haws, I take it that the ground of his antipathy was his own incapacity, and the distaste which a man feels for a woman who knows his defects and humiliations."
Well, that goes a long way.
Yeah.
Explain things.
That goes a long way. Wait. Oh, sorry. I had to grab my notes there. So I think, apart from, Caroline's hygiene issues, or listen, the two of them were neither, Adonis and Aphrodite here. So each one of them thought the other was physically distasteful in terms of that. And if you look at George's taste in women, they were all zoftig, florid, overblown, blousy women with, extremely bosomy, big tushes. Of course, the Georgian era, that was the style anyway. The dresses, you cinched in waist and you accentuated the bosom, and the way that the skirts were made, it had bum rolls that accentuated the bum. But George's taste in women, George liked big women to begin with. So, and Caroline was in miniature a pocket-sized big woman. So in an odd way, she was sort of the right shape for him, and he claimed to be disgusted by her smell and her body odor, and the fact that she wasn't new and all of that stuff. He was creating excuses. Caroline took lovers. The Georgian era was a licentious body era. People loved sex then and were not ashamed to talk about it. It's only once we get into the Victorian era, which I love to call the Albertian era, because it was really Albert's prudism that turned Victoria away from being the fun-loving, sex-loving. If you've ever read Queen Victoria's diary entries, they're full of sexual gusto and passion. And it was Albert, who was the straight-laced one, who really was trying to rein in her exuberant personality. So when we get into the Albertian era of the, mid-19th century, before he just, just before he died, and then of course after he was dead, when Victoria said that she would rule England in Albert's vision, everything the way he wanted it. That's when we all start to get prudish about things, when England starts to get prudish. In the Georgian era, the Hanoverian era, it was a licentious era. So the fact that a woman loved to have sex, there's really a double standard here, because George could have as many women as he wanted, and people kind of rolled their eyes about it and went, yeah, but he has to ensure the succession of the throne. But Caroline couldn't, so she takes lovers, and suddenly there are all these investigations about her. She's having a blast of a time. She was probably, you could bring some cologne and fumigation spray from Montague House. She was probably one heck of a hostess there. I bet those dinner parties were wild. And she actually said, when she had her own establishment, she said, I can basically said something like, I can have a bedfellow anytime I want. There's nothing as wholesome as that.
Mm-hmm. Well, George tried to use that and that enthusiasm and the reputation to open up a number of investigations.
The first was called
the divorce
investigation. Sure. Well, Caroline loved children, and it was really so sad because she wanted to mother and cuddle her own child, deprived of that ability. At Montague House, she took in other children whose parents could not care for them, and basically ran sort of a foster home. One of those children was named Willie Austin, whose mother was Sophia Austin, and whose father had been a cashiered Deptford dock worker. And Willie Austin was born in 1802 at the Brownlow Street Hospital. And rumors started flying that Willie Austin was Caroline's child. Not true. And so George opened up an investigation that was named the Delicate Investigation, which was to the ultimate aim was to get a divorce from Caroline on the grounds that she had borne children out of wedlock. And the main sticking point was that Willie Austin, in fact, was her child, and that there were other children running around the home, and who knows where they were, yada, yada. But Sophia Austin testified and said, no, this is my child, and I have no place to leave him, and my husband was fired from his job as a dock worker in Deptford, and look up the records. And sure enough, the government went and they looked up the Brownlow Street Hospital records, and it proved that Willie Austin was the son of Sophia and her husband. And the government had no choice but to say, sorry, George, Willie Austin is not Caroline's child. We can find no proof that Caroline ever had any other children other than your daughter, Charlotte. And you've got nothing. So they had to drop that. George was insistent. He kept finding ways to do something, but he absolutely couldn't find anything on his wife other than that she was having a good time. And the government kept warning him, don't push too far because she's got plenty to say against you. And in fact, even during the Delicate Investigation, King George III cut off all ties between Caroline and his granddaughter Charlotte, which is really, and George loved his niece. Don't forget, Caroline is George's niece, is his sister's daughter. They're close. She's not just some woman from Germany that they shipped over on a boat to marry his son.
But Caroline was stifling under those conditions, so she left England, wound up in Italy, continued on with that kind of promiscuous lifestyle. While she was there, she was informed about the death of her daughter.
Yes. Well, first in 1814, after really 20 years of mistreatment under George, because she'd come over in 1794. 1814, she said, I've had enough of this. It's like being in jail. So she decided to leave England, and she spent the better part of those years in Italy, where she had an affair with a member of her entourage, a much younger Italian man named Bartolomeo Pergami, which is quite the mouthful. And this went on for a number of years. And in the meantime, in 1818, investigation number 2, before we get to the death of George III, investigation number 2, the Milan investigation. George, who is now Prince Regent because his father is incapacitated due to mental issues, which for a long time we believed was from porphyria. There are many different reasons as to why George III became incapacitated. But in any event, the Prince Regent, who is Caroline's husband, obviously, now sends 3 men over to Milan to investigate Caroline's adulterous behavior, most notably with Bartolomeo Pergami. And they want to, because George still wants his divorce. And they interview 85 witnesses in Italy, most of which are Italian domestics and tradespeople that have dealt with Caroline while she was living in Italy. And Caroline surmised that they had been coerced or bribed or frightened into testifying to these 3 men, into giving them depositions. And ultimately, the Milan Commission comes back and they present their report to the government, and the government says, we are going to have a hard time proving that there's any there, because these witnesses, the depositions had to be translated from Italian into English, and there may be some discrepancies, and they're all servants, and not so sure that the depositions of Italian servants will count in an English court of law. And you can't prove that Caroline committed treason with an Italian, because how can an Italian commit treason against a British king? If you're the regent, you're acting as king. How can an Italian subject commit treason against a king not of his own country? Sorry, it doesn't wash. And Caroline's lawyer, Henry Brougham, said he had a really, it's a sad defense for Caroline, but his defense was that you really couldn't prove that this was an affair, that this was just a sad, pathetic, one-sided crush of an older woman for a handsome young Italian stud. And guess what? The British government bought it. They also bought Henry Brougham's defense for Caroline, that there's some things she could bring up, some skeletons in your closet, Georgie Porgy, that you don't want brought up, like, oh, Mariah Fitzherbert and all of your adulteries. There's a whole lot more she could say about you that are going to completely damage your future. You're the Prince Regent. You ever want to be king? I don't think so. So Caroline wins again. So now we fast forward to January 1820, and Caroline is informed by Henry Brougham. She's in Livorno now in Italy, which is Leghorn to the British. She is informed that George III has died, and that means her estranged husband is now king, George IV, and she is now Queen of England. And Henry Brougham says in his first letter to her, you better get over to England right away so you can be crowned. And Caroline is like, great, I'll be right over. And then second letter shows up and says, wait, I spoke too quickly. George says that if you stay on the continent, you will be queen in name, and he won't bug you anymore. But if you try to come to England, he's going to make life hell for you, and he won't let you be queen. And Caroline says, yeah, I'm coming anyway. So Caroline gets on a boat, and she sails to England. And when she gets there, she is cheered. And her carriage is unhorsed and pulled by English countrymen who are cheering no queen, no king. They are all pro Caroline because they all know how terribly George has treated her. And they know that he pulled this crap with the delicate investigation back in 1806, and they know that he just pulled this crap with the Milan Commission in 1818, and now it's 1820, and he's about to pull something with his coronation. And Caroline is not going to let him have it. She's insisting that she's going to be crowned alongside her husband. But George isn't going to have it. George is going to be a jerk till the very last. So he's going to try divorce bill number 3. And this is something that was never tried before in the history of the British monarchy, and it hasn't been tried since. 1821, July, just weeks before George's coronation is set, George insists that the government bring a bill of pains and penalties, which will deprive Caroline, which will grant George a divorce and deprive Caroline of all of her titles. George has already, now that he's king but not yet crowned, there hasn't yet been a coronation because these things take time to plan. And of course, George wants to get his coronation robes all made. I've seen them. They're in Brighton. They're quite amazing. George already, his first act as king is to exhort the Church of England to strike Caroline's name from the Sunday liturgy so that Britons no longer have to say their name and pray for her every Sunday. We pray for the king, we pray for the queen, the health of blah, 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 which is about as petty as it gets. I mean, what a little small petty jerk. So you really have to you have to feel for Caroline. So the Bill of Pains and Penalties is first introduced in the House of Lords by the government, and Henry Brougham argues for Caroline, and of course brings up the fact that Caroline could say a whole lot worse about her husband than George could say about her, because already he's got nothing on her. He keeps losing. And the vote is pretty close. And you would expect the House of Lords to more or less be on the king's side. And they decide finally to withdraw the bill because Henry Brougham, speaking on Caroline's behalf, says she could bring up every single one of your infidelities. Caroline, meanwhile, all these years has been keeping a list. In fact, when George III was alive and he had deprived her of seeing their daughter, she said, "You keep doing that. I've been keeping a list of everything your son has done to me. And I will air that. I will take it to the press. And they will publish it because I'm the Princess of Wales." And that's when George III, years earlier, during the delicate investigation, had backed off and said, okay, you can see your daughter. Okay, you can come back to the bosom of the royal family. You don't have to see my son, but you can see the rest of us. You can see me and you can see the queen. So Caroline's been keeping this list carefully for 20, 25 years. There's plenty of evidence that Henry Brougham can present to Parliament, to the House of Lords on her behalf. And then, of course, there's Maria Fitzherbert right there. This clandestine marriage that even a few years earlier, when George had wanted to rekindle the romance with her while he's still married to Caroline, Maria said, okay, fine, I will live with you again if the Pope sanctions our marriage. And guess what the Pope did? And the Pope said, yeah, you're legitimately married in the eyes of the Catholic Church and the papacy. Not by the state, obviously, but yeah, you're legitimately married as far as the Catholic Church is concerned. So that could completely be dredged up, and therefore by the 1701 Act of Settlement and the 1707 Act of Union, which settled the succession on the descendants of the Electress Sophia of Hanover, and which means that no one who marries a Catholic or who is a Catholic can ever again become the British monarch. George would no longer be eligible. All of that came out absolutely into the light, 100%, with the sun shining brightly upon it. George is toast. So the government, George's lawyer comes to him and says, we have to withdraw this. We have to withdraw this bill of pains and penalties because you're done. This comes out, forget it. Because we then have to present this to the House of Commons. If this goes through the House of Lords, we then have to, the House of Commons will kill you. They'll absolutely vote in favor of your estranged wife. You're done. So they withdraw the bill of pains and penalties and strike 3 against Georgie Porgy. So now George does the only thing left in his arsenal. There's his last arrow in, excuse me, the last arrow in his quiver, which is to deprive Caroline of being coronated beside him. So we're up to the coronation, which is in July 1821, I could check my notes. I think we're in July 19th. And he hires prize fighters to actually stand guard at the doors of Westminster Abbey. And on the inside, he's got soldiers with crossed bayonets in case somehow she gets past the prize fighters. Gentleman Jackson was the top, the Muhammad Ali of his day. Even now, Muhammad Ali's not of our day anymore, rest in peace, rest in power. But he hires Gentleman Jackson and those of his ilk. These prize fighters are guarding the door. And Caroline shows up with her Lord Hood, who is her equerry, and Lady Hood, who's one of her ladies in waiting, and another lady in waiting, and they show up at the door in the Dean's Yard, which would be where she'd enter, and there's Gentleman Jackson. They're barring the door, and they say, sorry, you can't enter. She said, I'm the Queen. And she starts banging on the door, let me open up, I'm the Queen. And Lord Hood says, I've got a ticket. It's signed by Wellington. You have to let me in. And the guy at the door says, well, that's just one ticket. There's 4 of you. And he says, well, I'll give my ticket to the Queen. And she tries to get in, and that's how she sees the crossed bayonets. And finally, she's screaming, I'm the Queen, you have to let me in, you have to let me in. And she realizes there's no way they're not going to let her in. The Queen of England, deprived of being crowned beside her husband, finally, completely demoralized, she slinks away. And the saddest thing, and the thing that I don't understand, is that as she slinks away, the crowd outside that's kind of gathered to see all the swells who are coming in and out of the Abbey are jeering at her. The same people who cheered a few weeks earlier, no Queen, no King, are jeering at her, and they're shouting, go back to Pergami. This is something that I just don't understand, how quickly the mob mentality turns. They like you if you're a winner. They hate you if you're a loser. And yet they didn't like George. They much preferred Caroline to George, which is one thing, even when George died, the Times of London wrote how detested he was. And that's the newspaper of record for the royalty, basically, for the monarch.
And just as sadly, little did anybody realize, but that Caroline would be dead shortly after the coronation. And
yeah, it's really tragic. Whether she was sick already somehow and nobody knew it, but yeah, just a few weeks later, she developed a inflammation and obstruction of the bowels, it said, and dosed herself with calomel, which is mercury. It was what they used to give people during the American Civil War, which would basically kill you. Yeah, she dosed herself with enough calomel and castor oil, quote, to turn the stomach of a horse.
Ooh.
Yeah,
Oh my
yeah.
gosh.
I mean, she had a physician, but she was obviously self-medicating. So and she said she asked to be buried in Brunswick with a simple epitaph on her coffin, Caroline of Brunswick, the murdered queen.
Mm-hmm.
And she
Mm-hmm.
talked out of that and into mollifying it, so it said the injured queen. But as she was dying, she told Lord Hood, and she said it in French, je ne mourrai pas sans douleur, mais je mourrai sans regret. I don't die without sorrow, but I die without regret. And so she was only 53 years old when she died, but really, she'd sort of been dying slowly ever since the day she met George.
And George, what lasted maybe another 10 years or so, and he
George
eventually
died.
deteriorated physically.
Well, excess was never enough for him. I mean, he was fat to begin with because he overindulged in everything, whether it was food or sex or it was anything but exercise. Let's put it that way. But he lived another 10 years. He reigned from 1820 to 1830 as king proper, although he was regent from 1811 to 1820. And he died as a result of a burst blood vessel in his abdomen. And, very, very little more. July 16th, 1830, the Times of London editorialized, there was never an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. I mean, it's hard to imagine the Times, since saying something like that, because usually, I don't know what they said when the disgraced Edward VIII died, but it couldn't have been much worse than this. I mean, as much as Caroline herself was disliked, her husband was disliked even more, which was another reason, apart from the fact that they really had no concrete proof against Caroline for all of these alleged infidelities. They had so much proof against George that for whatever Caroline did, everything her husband did was so much worse and provable.
So he was definitely a detestable character, but I mean, this is an element that we hadn't spoken about. But he was literate to a large extent. He did help to elevate the arts in England because he loved the arts, and actually some people felt he had potential as a leader. Now Caroline had potential.
Potential as a leader, yeah. I never saw his potential as a leader. To me, he was a play actor. In fact, he even designed a military uniform for a regiment that never existed because he was such a wannabe. He was never a soldier. Wanted to be. He admired soldiers tremendously, but he never was one. And he never joined, unlike some of his younger brothers, he never actually joined the military. He didn't join the Navy, didn't join the Army. But he was indeed a tremendous patron of the arts. In fact, in 1815, James Stanier Clark, who was George's personal librarian, asked Jane Austen, when you ask, it's a royal command when it comes from the Prince Regent's librarian, asked Jane Austen to dedicate her next book to the Prince Regent. She couldn't stand him, but she had no other choice. So that's one reason where if you look at a frontispiece of Emma, it's dedicated to the Prince Regent.
That puts everything into perspective, that dedication.
Yes, indeed.
So just one final question here, and that is maybe to sum up the character of Caroline, because in a large way, this is about her. She'd been raised in a different type of royal court, as you mentioned earlier, but lacked some of the social etiquette for England. How would you sum up her character then?
Well, first of all, I'd say that both were overweight, oversexed, and overdressed. That's for sure. But George, going back to George was a malignant narcissist, and he blamed everyone else for woes that were of his own making. But Caroline is really best described in the words of other people. And in fact, first I'll let Jane Austen have the penultimate last word, and then I'm going to give the last word to somebody else. Because we just discussed the dedication that was forced upon Jane by James Stanier Clark, Prinny's librarian, describing Caroline. Poor woman, Jane wrote. I shall support her as long as I can because she is a woman and because I hate her husband. If I must give up the princess, I am resolved at least always to think that she would have been respectable if the prince had behaved tolerably by her at first. And I'm going to give the last word to their very tragic daughter, Caroline, who died of puerperal fever, really. And of course, that would have ensured the succession. That's why we have Queen Victoria, because Charlotte died of childbirth right after. Princess Charlotte would later observe, my mother was bad, but she would not have become as bad as she was if my father had not been infinitely worse.
Wow. Ouch.
And that was a young lady who, did not grow up with either parent parenting her, and who actually had a love match. And I think that sort of has to be said too, that Charlotte was, in an odd way, very much a combination of both parents. She was extremely headstrong, would not listen to I want to say would not listen to reason, but that's not really true. If her father said, sit, stay, she's like, oh, hell no, I don't have to listen to you. And her father systematically fired governesses who got too close to her, put ones in place who would spy on her. Charlotte at one point ran away from home, got caught, and refused to marry the man that her father wanted her to marry, and instead married the one that she wanted to. And it was, however brief, it was a love match. And Leopold of Belgium ultimately turned out to be, became king of the Belgians, and is Uncle Leopold, who Queen Victoria speaks of. That's Queen Victoria's Uncle Leopold. So I love how, obviously all these stories are connected because all these people are related, because all these cousins keep marrying each other, and of course it's Leopold's nephew, Prince Albert, who Victoria marries, and Victoria and Albert were first cousins.
Yeah. How many others were there? Is it? But the whole amazing story just goes to show you that history repeats itself
Absolutely
over and over again. Yeah. Well, Leslie, I want to thank you so much for leading us through this weird and a somewhat disturbing stage in England's history.
It certainly is, but I want to say I hope that we learned things from this, but I don't know if we ever do, because there are certain archetypes of character that we keep finding in history. And I'm not a student of psychology, but I started out as an actress professionally, and it helps me when I go through all of these histories, and I've always been a student of history as well, but to get inside the heads of these people and wonder what they were thinking. And I always search for their humanity as I write this. I write my histories because nothing happens in a vacuum, and people make decisions and choices, and they're not often the best choices, but they come from somewhere. And I think ultimately everybody is looking for love, or they're looking for acceptance, or they're looking for approval, or they're looking for applause. And how they go about power, Nothing's changed. Or they have power and they abuse it. In whether it's in a marriage situation, or they in royal marriages where women had no power. Imagine not being able to choose your own spouse or having to fight for that. It wasn't so very long ago. No, I'm thinking even back to when I said that this was a strange brew of Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves and Charles and Diana. Even when you think about the fact that Prince Philip was urging his son, hurry up, we're going to need an heir, and urging him to marry this 19-year-old naif. It was really not Charles's choice to marry Diana, and Diana got in over her head. Of course, in no way could Diana be compared to Caroline of Brunswick, but how many times have we seen a Prince of Wales who is 30 plus years old and a father going tick-tock, time runs apace. The succession of the dynasty is of primary importance here. Go find thee a wife.
That may be changing a little bit.
It is, yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and that is the humanity of it. So, yeah. Leslie, again, I want to thank you for taking time to talk to us about it, and hopefully we'll.
Thank you for contacting me.
And I thank all of you for tuning into Outrageous History. We'll see you again soon. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.